I stared at the email notification lighting up my phone, a familiar mix of anger and betrayal washing over me. The college tuition bill was due, and despite my father's years of promises, a small part of me still hoped he'd honor his word. But as I opened the message from the financial aid office, my stomach dropped. My tuition remained unpaid, with a final warning that I'd be dropped from my classes in 7 days. That's when I knew for certain my father had actually gone through with it, giving my entire college fund to my stepsister Amber. I remember the exact moment I found out. 3 weeks earlier, standing in the kitchen of my childhood home, my father's words still echo in my head. Amber deserves it more, Logan. You've got your military benefits. She has nothing. As if the 4 years I spent in Afghanistan meant I deserved less from my own father. As if my service was a convenient excuse to favor his new family over his obligations to me. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound I'd sustained overseas. This money wasn't some casual gift. It was the college fund my mother had started for me before she died when I was 9. The fund my father had promised to keep growing for me, year after year. The fund that was now, apparently, completely gone. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus on the email. The words blurring through tears I refused to let fall. $700 due by September 30th. Money I didn't have. Money that should have been there waiting for me. Money that had apparently gone to Amber's fashion design program in New York instead. After leaving the military last year, I'd enrolled in engineering school, ready to build a civilian life with the education my mother had dreamed for me. The GI Bill covered some costs, but not everything. That's what my college fund was supposed to be for. That's what had been promised to me. But promises, I was learning, meant different things to different people. My roommate Tyler walked in as I sat motionless on our worn couch staring at my phone. "Dude, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, dropping his backpack on the floor. "What's going on?" My dad gave my entire college fund to Amber. The words felt strange leaving my mouth, like I was telling someone else's story. "The fund my mom started before she died. All of it." Tyler stopped, his expression shifting from casual concern to outright shock. "He did what? Can he even do that? I thought that money was specifically for you." Apparently, he was the custodian of the account. Legally, he could do whatever he wanted with it. I ran my hands through my hair, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper with each passing second. I'm going to be dropped from my classes if I don't come up with nearly $9,000 in a week. That's messed up, man. Beyond messed up. Tyler sat down next to me, the ancient couch creaking under our weight. "What are you going to do?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Called the school. They told me about your tuition situation. We should talk. Dinner at the house on Friday?" The casual tone, as if he hadn't just demolished my educational future. As if this was just some minor misunderstanding rather than a profound betrayal. If you're watching this and it sounds familiar, hit subscribe now because this is just the beginning. Sometimes the people who should protect us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. Stay tuned, because what happened next changed everything. Not just for me, but for my entire family. The apartment Tyler and I shared was nothing special. A 2-bedroom unit in a complex mostly populated by other students about a mile from campus. But it was mine. I'd chosen it, paid for it with my housing allowance, decorated it with the few possessions I'd accumulated during my time in the service. A far cry from the spacious suburban house my father shared with his new wife Diane and stepdaughter Amber, but it was my space, my sanctuary. I paced the small living room, unable to sit still as the reality of my situation continued to sink in. 4 years in Afghanistan, including one deployment to a forward operating base that had been under near constant attack. I'd lost friends there, seen things that still woke me up at night, and I'd done it all with the promise that education, my future, waited for me back home. I'd known that my father had remarried while I was overseas. Diane seemed nice enough in our limited video calls. Amber, her daughter from a previous marriage, had always been in the background, a sullen teenager with little to say to me. Dad seemed happy, and I was glad for him. After losing Mom to cancer when I was 9, he'd been alone for a long time. What I hadn't known was how completely he'd integrated into their lives, and how completely I'd been pushed to the periphery of his. It became clearer each time I visited. Photos of Amber's high school graduation prominently displayed, while my military portrait was tucked away on a side table in the study. Conversations that revolved around Diane's job promotion, Amber's college applications, their summer vacation plans. My deployment, my return to civilian life, my college plans, these earned passing interest at best. But I'd never imagined it would come to this, to giving away the money my mother had set aside for me. The final connection I had to her plans, for my future. I picked up my phone, staring at my father's text, anger building inside me with each passing second. I had half a mind to ignore it entirely, but I needed answers. I needed to hear him explain himself, look me in the eye and tell me why Amber deserved my college fund more than I did. "I'll be there," I typed, adding nothing more. No looking forward to it, no emoticon, nothing to soften the digital silence between us. His response came quickly. "Great, Diane's making lasagna, your favorite." I almost laughed. Lasagna hadn't been my favorite since I was 12. For the past decade, it had actually been my father's favorite. Just one more small detail about me he'd forgotten or never bothered to learn. "Logan?" Tyler's voice pulled me back from my thoughts. "You gonna be okay?" I realized I'd been standing motionless, staring at my phone for who knows how long. The military teaches you to compartmentalize, to push emotions aside to deal with the task at hand. But some betrayals cut too deep for those techniques to work. "Don't know," I answered honestly. "I really don't know." "You could take out loans," Tyler suggested. "It's not fair, but at least you could stay in school." The thought of taking on debt for something that should have been mine, that had been mine, only intensified my anger. But Tyler was right. I couldn't let my father's betrayal derail my education, my future. I'd already sacrificed too much for it. "Yeah," I nodded, my jaw tight. "I'll figure it out. Always do." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, memories flooding back, not just of the recent betrayal, but of a pattern that had been forming for years. The missed high school graduation because Amber had a dance recital the same weekend. The forgotten birthday calls during my deployment. The subtle shift from, "when you get home, we'll," to, "we've been so busy with Amber's college tours." It wasn't just about the money, though that was devastating enough. It was about what the money represented. My place in my father's life, in what should have been our family. A place that seemed to be shrinking with each passing year until apparently it had disappeared entirely. The next morning, I met with the financial aid office. The advisor, a kind-eyed woman named Ms. Patel, reviewed my file with obvious concern. "Your military benefits cover a portion, as you know," she explained. "But there's still this outstanding balance, and unfortunately, the deadline for most scholarships this semester has passed." "What about loans?" I asked, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. She nodded, typing rapidly on her keyboard. "You would qualify for federal loans to cover the remainder. I can help you with the application today if you'd like." I thought about what taking on debt would mean, about working through college rather than focusing solely on my studies as I'd planned, about graduating with financial obligations rather than the clean slate I'd been promised. But what choice did I have? "Let's do it," I said, sitting straighter in my chair. "What do I need to sign?" By the time Friday rolled around, I'd secured emergency loans to cover my tuition. Classes would start on Monday and I'd be in them, no thanks to my father. I'd also picked up additional shifts at the campus Veterans Center where I worked part-time, hoping to minimize the debt I'd need to take on in future semesters. As I pulled into the driveway of my father's house, the house I'd never lived, and had never been asked to consider home, my stomach knotted with tension. The two-story colonial with its manicured lawn and professional landscaping seemed to mock me, a physical manifestation of priorities that clearly didn't include me. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts. I'd spent 4 years in combat zones. I could handle one dinner, one conversation, even if it promised to be one of the most difficult of my life. The front door opened before I could knock, my father standing there with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. James Erickson, once my hero, now a stranger who had betrayed not just me, but my mother's memory. "Logan," he said, stepping forward as if to hug me, then seeming to think better of it when he saw my expression. Come in, dinner's almost ready." I followed him into the house, noticing new furniture in the living room, a large piece of abstract art that must have cost thousands hanging over the fireplace. The house smelled of garlic and tomato sauce, the promised lasagna already filling the air. In the kitchen, Diane stood at the counter, arranging a salad in an elaborate crystal bowl I'd never seen before. "Logan!" she exclaimed, her voice too high, too cheerful. "So good to see you. It's been too long. 3 months, I thought, but didn't say. 3 months since I'd been invited for a brief, awkward Sunday lunch. 3 months in which my father had apparently decided to reassign my future to his stepdaughter. "Where's Amber?" my father asked, looking toward the staircase. "Amber! Logan's here!" "Coming!" a voice called from upstairs. I stood uncomfortably in the kitchen, declining Diane's offer of a glass of wine. I needed a clear head for what was coming. When Amber finally descended the stairs, I was struck by how different she looked from the last time I'd seen her. Gone was the sullen teenager, replaced by a confident young woman in designer jeans and an expensive-looking blouse. Her hair was highlighted, her makeup perfect. She looked like she belonged in this house in a way I never had. "Hey," she said, barely making eye contact. "Dad said you were coming for dinner." Dad. Not your dad or James, but Dad. When had that happened? She'd always called him James before, at least when I was around. "Let's eat," my father said too loudly, gesturing toward the dining room with its gleaming table already set with what looked like new china. "We've got a lot to catch up on." The small talk during dinner was excruciating. Questions about my classes, as if my father didn't know I'd nearly been dropped from them because of what he'd done. Comments about Amber's first few weeks at fashion, school in New York, how she'd already impressed her professors, how expensive the city was, but how they'd made it work. Made it work with my money, I thought, stabbing at my lasagna. Finally, as Diane cleared the plates and Amber conveniently remembered a video call she needed to make with a classmate, I was left alone with my father. "I imagine you have questions," he said, his voice quieter now, eyes fixed on his wine glass rather than on me. "Just one," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Why?" He sighed, looking suddenly older than his 53 years. "It's complicated, Logan. Try me. I think I can keep up." Another sigh. Amber's father has never been in the picture. Not a dime of child support, not a single birthday acknowledged. When her design school acceptance came through, it's one of the top programs in the country, you know, she didn't have anything set aside. No college fund, no savings. "So you gave her mine," I said flatly. "The one Mom started for me before she died." He had the decency to flinch at the mention of my mother. "You have your military benefits. You're set. Amber had nothing, and this opportunity, I'm not set," I interrupted, my control slipping. "The GI Bill doesn't cover everything. You know, that. We've talked about it. That fund was supposed to cover the gap. Now I'm taking out loans for money that should have been mine." "I'm sorry about that," he said, not sounding particularly sorry. But Amber needed. What about what I needed? The question burst out of me, louder than I intended. What about what Mom wanted for me? That money wasn't just from you, it was from her. Your mother would have understood, he said, a flash of irritation crossing his face. She would have wanted to help a young woman with no other options. The invocation of my mother's wishes pushed me to the edge. Don't you dare tell me what Mom would have wanted. She wanted that money to go to her son's education. That's why she started the fund in the first place. My father's expression hardened. I think I knew your mother a little better than you did, Logan. You were only 9 when she died. The words hit like a physical blow. It was true. My memories of my mother had faded over the years, preserved, mainly in photographs and the few stories my father had been willing to share. But to use that against me, to use it to justify betraying her wishes for me, was beyond cruel. I stood up, unable to sit across from him for another minute. I secured emergency loans. I'll be fine without your help, just like I have been since I was 18. Logan, don't be dramatic. You're still my son. We're still family. Family doesn't do what you did, I said, heading for the front door. You made your choice. You chose Amber. Just be honest about it. That's not fair, he called after me. You're twisting this situation. I turned back, hand on the doorknob. Am I? You gave my college fund, the one my dead mother started for me, to your stepdaughter because, in your words, she deserves it more. What exactly am I twisting? You have opportunities she doesn't have. The military gave me PTSD and a partial education benefit in exchange for 4 years of my life and watching my friends die. I cut in, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. It didn't give me what was already mine. What should have been waiting for me when I got home. With that, I walked out, ignoring him calling my name behind me. In my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, struggling to control my breathing. The part of me that would always be a soldier was running combat breathing techniques, counting inhales and exhales, forcing my heart rate to slow. When I finally felt steady enough to drive, I pulled away from the house without looking back. Whatever relationship I'd had with my father, whatever illusions I'd maintained about my place in his life, had been shattered, not just by his actions, but by his complete failure to understand why those actions were so devastating. Little did I know that this confrontation was just the beginning. Within a month, a chance discovery would reveal the truth about Amber, about the money, and about secrets my father had been keeping from all of us. Secrets that would redefine not just my understanding of his betrayal, but of my mother's, life and death as well. The weekend after the disastrous dinner with my father passed in a blur of suppressed anger and frantic preparation for the upcoming semester. I threw myself into organizing textbooks, reviewing syllabi, and picking up extra shifts at the Veterans Center. Anything to keep my mind off the betrayal that still felt like an open wound. Tyler tried his best to help, offering to cover groceries, until my next VA payment came through, suggesting we hit the campus gym to blow off steam. But there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. Not because of anything Tyler had done, but because some experiences can't be fully understood from the outside. You know, he said Sunday night as we sat watching a football game neither of us cared about. You could fight this, legally, I mean. If the money was from your mom specifically for your education. I looked into it. I cut him off, the research I'd done still fresh in my mind. Dad was the custodian of the account. Legally, he had control until I turned 25. I was 23, 2 years short of when the money would have become fully mine. That's messed up, Tyler muttered, shaking his head. Yeah, it is. I took a long drink of my beer, wishing it could wash away the bitter taste this whole situation had left. Monday morning came with the familiar nervous energy of a new semester. Campus bustled with returning students. the air filled with that unique mixture of excitement and anxiety that marked academic beginnings. In another life, the one where my father had honored his promises, I might have been focused solely on the educational journey ahead. Instead, I found myself in the financial aid office again, double-checking that my emergency loans had been processed, that I wouldn't be kicked out of my classes before they even began. Ms. Patel greeted me with the same sympathetic smile she'd worn during our previous meeting. "Everything's in order, Mr. Erickson," she assured me, sliding a folder across her desk. "Here's the final paperwork for your records. Just remember, these loans start accruing interest immediately, unlike some of the subsidized options we discussed." I nodded, taking the folder without opening it. Another reminder of what this betrayal would cost me, not just emotionally, but financially for years to come. "By the way," she added as I stood to leave, "the Veterans Resource Office called about you. Something about additional work-study hours becoming available." The news was the first positive thing I'd heard in weeks. Extra hours meant extra income, which meant less loan debt to carry forward. I thanked her and headed straight to the Veterans Resource Office, a small suite of rooms in the Student Union building that had become something of a second home since I'd enrolled. Major Collins, retired Army, now the Director of Veterans Affairs for the university, waved me into his office as soon as he saw me. With his military-precise haircut and perpetually perfect posture, he seemed out of place amid the casual chaos of campus life. But to those of us transitioning from service to student life, he was a welcome anchor to the world we'd left behind. "Erickson," he greeted me, firm handshake and direct eye contact, military habits that died hard. "Glad you stopped by. Got an opportunity I think you'd be perfect for." He explained that the office had received additional funding for peer counseling, specifically focused on academic adjustment. The position required someone who understood both military structure and academic demands, who could help newly discharged veterans navigate the jarring transition from the rigid hierarchy of service to the self-directed nature of university life. 20 hours a week, better pay than your current position," Collins said, sliding a job description across his desk. "Plus, it'll look good on your resume when you graduate." I scanned the document, relief washing over me. This wasn't just a job. It was an answer to the most immediate problem created by my father's betrayal. It wouldn't replace the entirety of what I'd lost, but it would help mitigate the damage. "When would I start?" I asked, already mentally rearranging my schedule. "Can you handle next Monday? We've got 4 new vets starting classes this term who could use some guidance." "I'll make it work," I assured him, standing to shake his hand. Again. "Thank you, Major. This means a lot." He held my gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Everything okay, Erickson? You seem tense." For a brief moment, I considered telling him everything. About my father, the college fund, the sudden financial strain. In the military, we'd been taught to speak up when personal issues might affect mission readiness. But this was different. This was family dirty laundry, private shame. "Just first-week jitters," I lied, forcing a smile. "I'm good." He didn't look. Convinced, but nodded anyway. "My door's always open, son. Not just for work issues." I thanked him again and left, clutching the job description like a lifeline. In the hallway outside his office, I leaned against the wall for a moment, letting the relief wash over me. It wasn't a solution to everything, but it was something tangible, something I could control in a situation where so much had been taken from my control. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Diane, of all people. "Logan, please call your father. He's very upset about how things ended Friday night." I stared at the message, a familiar anger rising within me. He was upset? After what he'd done, he had the audacity to be the wounded party? I shoved the phone back in my pocket without responding. Let him be upset. Let him feel a fraction of what I'd been feeling since discovering his betrayal. The first week of classes passed in a blur of syllabi reviews, textbook purchases, and orientation for my new position at the Veterans Resource Office. By Friday, I had established a routine that left little time for dwelling on family drama, exactly as I'd intended. Between classes, work, and studying, I could almost convince myself that I'd moved beyond the hurt, that I was building a new life independent of my father's support or betrayal. Then came the email that shattered that illusion. It arrived Friday afternoon as I sat in the campus library, working on preliminary research for an engineering ethics paper. The sender name caught my eye immediately: Amber Holloway, my stepsister. The subject line was equally direct: about the money. For several minutes, I simply stared at the notification, my finger hovering over the delete button. What could she possibly have to say that I wanted to hear? Was this some attempt at justification? A request for forgiveness? Or worse, a message sent at my father's urging, another manipulation designed to bring me back into line? Curiosity won out over anger. I opened the email. Logan, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know the money was yours, specifically yours. Dad told me he had savings set aside that could help with my tuition. He never mentioned it was your college fund, never said anything about it being started by your mom. I found out yesterday when I overheard him and Mom fighting about it. She's furious, Logan. Said he had no right to take your inheritance. I feel terrible. I never would have accepted if I'd known the truth. I grew up without a dad, and I know how much it sucks when the parent who should have your back lets you down. I don't know if this helps at all, but I wanted you to know I wasn't part of some conspiracy against you. And I'm trying to figure out how to make it right. Amber. I read the message 3 times, trying to process this new information. Diane hadn't known either. She was angry on my behalf. It changed the narrative I'd constructed, that they were all in on it together, a united front against the outsider. Before I could decide how to respond, or whether to respond at all, my phone rang. Amber's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated before answering, stepping outside the library for privacy. Hello? Logan? Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, uncertain. Did you get my email? Just now, I confirmed, keeping my tone neutral. What do you mean you're trying to make it right? She took a deep breath, audible over the connection. I'm trying to find a way to pay you back. Not all at once, obviously. It's a lot of money and I'm just starting school, but over time. It wasn't right what Dad did. No, I agreed. It wasn't. He and Mom had a huge fight last night, she continued, words tumbling out quickly now. I've never seen her so angry. She kept saying that he'd betrayed your mother's memory, that she'd never have approved of using your money for me. This matched what I'd thought myself, but hearing it from Amber, hearing that Diane shared this view, was unexpected validation. Mom didn't know either? I asked, seeking confirmation. No. She found out when she was going through some paperwork, for taxes or something, and saw the transfer from your account. She confronted Dad, and that's when I overheard them. I leaned against the brick wall of the library, trying to absorb this new information. It didn't change what my father had done, but it did shift the landscape of alliances I'd assumed. I wasn't alone in seeing his actions as a betrayal. Logan? Amber's voice pulled me back to the conversation. Are you still there? Yeah, I'm here. Just processing. I get it, she said quietly. Look, I know we're not close. We've never really had the chance to be. But I want you to know I'm on your side in this. What Dad did wasn't fair to you. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. After weeks of feeling completely isolated in my anger, having someone, especially someone I'd assumed was complicit, acknowledge the wrongness of what had happened was strangely powerful. I appreciate that, I managed, keeping my voice steady, with military discipline. But I don't expect you to pay me back. This isn't your fault. Maybe not, but I benefited from it. That makes me responsible in some way. Her tone shifted, became more determined. Anyway, I've already decided. I'm taking on more work-study hours at the design school, and I've applied for some additional scholarships for next semester. Whatever I can put together, I'll send to you. The offer was meaningful, even if it wouldn't solve the immediate financial pressure. We can talk about it, I said, unwilling to commit to an arrangement that might burden her unnecessarily. I'd been angry at my father, not at her. How's your mom handling all this? Amber paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. She's reconsidering a lot of things. Their whole relationship, maybe. I've never seen her like this, Logan. She keeps saying there must be other things he hasn't told her. If he could lie about something as important as your inheritance. The revelation sent a chill through me. I hadn't considered the wider implications of my father's actions, how his betrayal of me might reflect deeper patterns in his life, patterns that could affect Diane as well. I'm sorry, I said, surprised to realize I meant it. This must be hard for both of you. Not as hard as what? You're going through, she countered. But thanks. It helps to talk to someone who understands how complicated your dad can be. Your dad, not our dad. The distinction didn't escape me. Listen, Amber continued. There's something else. Something weird I found when I was helping Mom look through some of Dad's papers. An insurance policy I don't think he knows we saw. It was for your mom, a big one, taken out just a few months before she died. My breath caught. What kind of insurance policy? Life insurance, for like $1 million. But the weird thing is, Mom says he's never mentioned it. Never indicated there was such a large payout after your mom died. She assumed there'd been some modest insurance, sure, but nothing like this. My mind raced with implications. $1 million life insurance policy my father had never mentioned? Where had that money gone? And why take out such a large policy just months before my mother's death from cancer? I need to see it, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. The policy, I mean. That's why I'm calling, actually. Mom made copies. She thinks you have a right to know. Amber's voice dropped almost to a whisper. She's scared, Logan. Says there's something not right about all this. When can I see these documents? The world around me. Students walking. To class, birds chirping in nearby trees. Seemed suddenly distant, unreal compared to the mystery unfolding through this unexpected conversation. Tomorrow? Mom's taking Dad to some work thing in the city. The house will be empty from noon until evening. I can meet you there. I agreed immediately, my mind already spinning with questions. A secret insurance policy. Money that had vanished. A convenient transfer of my college fund that might just be the tip of an iceberg of financial deception. Logan, Amber said before we hung up. Be careful, okay? I don't know what all this means, but Mom's really freaked out. She's talking about consulting an attorney. After we disconnected, I stood motionless outside the library, the September sunshine suddenly feeling cold against my skin. What had begun as a personal betrayal, painful but straightforward, was evolving into something more complex, more disturbing. Little did I know that the documents waiting for me at my father's house would reveal secrets far darker than financial. Manipulation, secrets that would explain not just why my college fund had been taken, but why my father had been so desperate for money that he'd steal from his own son. Secrets that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about my mother's death, about the man who had raised me, and about the web of lies that had shaped my life for 14 years. Part of me wanted to call Amber back, to say I'd changed my mind, that I didn't want to know what waited in those papers. But the larger part, the part that had faced incoming fire in Afghanistan, that had held dying friends and promised to carry their memories home, that part knew that truth, however painful, was always better than comforting lies. Tomorrow, I would face whatever reality those documents revealed. Today, I had engineering problems to solve, veteran peers to counsel, a life to build from the pieces my father's betrayal had left me. I returned to the library, to my half-written paper, to the mundane tasks that now seemed like a I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions about the insurance policy Amber had mentioned. $1 million. The sum was staggering, especially considering our modest middle-class upbringing. Where had that money gone? Why had my father never mentioned it? And most disturbing of all, why had he taken out such a massive policy just months before my mother's death? When morning finally came, I gave up on sleep entirely and headed to the campus gym, hoping physical exertion might quiet the storm of theories and suspicions swirling through my head. I pushed myself through a punishing workout, the kind that had gotten me through the darkest days of deployment, running until my lungs burned, lifting until my muscles trembled. But even physical exhaustion couldn't dull the edge of my unease. By 11:30, I was showered, changed, and sitting in my car outside my father's house, 30 minutes early for my meeting with Amber. The neighborhood looked different in daylight, more ordinary, less imposing. Just houses, just people living their lives. Not the fortress of betrayal I'd built up in my mind. At 5 minutes to noon, a sleek BMW pulled into the driveway. Amber. She spotted me immediately and waved, gesturing for me to follow her inside. She looked different than she had at dinner. The week before, her designer outfit replaced by simple jeans and a university sweatshirt, her perfect makeup absent. More like the awkward teenager I remembered from video calls during my deployment. "Thanks for coming," she said as she unlocked the front door. "Mom and Dad left about an hour ago. We should have plenty of time." Inside, the house felt strangely hollow without my father's dominating presence. I followed Amber to the kitchen, where she had already laid out a folder of documents on the granite island. "Mom made copies of everything," she explained, sliding the folder toward me. "She's been investigating, I guess you could say, ever since she found out about your college fund." I opened the folder, my heart pounding. The first document was indeed a life insurance policy dated February 15, 2009. 4 months before my mother's death from what I'd always been told was a rapidly advancing breast cancer. The death benefit was clearly stated, $1,000. The beneficiary, James Erickson, my father. "Have you looked at the rest?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Amber nodded, her expression grave. "Some of it. Enough to understand why Mom's so freaked out." I continued through the documents, each page revealing another piece of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. Bank statements showing the insurance payout being deposited, then gradually transferred to offshore accounts. Medical records, copies my father had kept, with highlighted sections that made little sense to me. Terms like inconclusive and further testing recommended jumping out from pages of technical language. And then, buried in the middle of the stack, a handwritten letter from my mother to her sister, my Aunt Kate, who had died in a car accident 3 years after my mother. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Mom's death. "Dear Kate," it began in my mother's familiar looping handwriting. "I'm writing this while James is at work and Logan is at school. There's so much I need to tell you, but I'm not sure how much time I have left. The new symptoms are frightening. And James insists we stick with Dr. Peterson despite my concerns about his treatment plan. I've asked repeatedly for a second opinion, but James says it's unnecessary, that I'm just anxious. Maybe he's right, but something doesn't feel right about any of this." My hands began to shake as I continued reading. "The life insurance policy James took out seems excessive, especially given our financial situation. When I questioned it, he became defensive, accusing me of not trusting him. Perhaps I'm being paranoid, but combined with his insistence that I take these new medications that make me so ill, I can't help but worry. If anything happens to me, Kate, please make sure Logan is taken care of." The college fund is in James's. Control until Logan is 25. But it's meant for him. All of it. I've left detailed instructions with my attorney, though James doesn't know about this. Please check with Michael Goldman at Goldman & Associates if anything seems wrong. The letter continued with personal messages of love and worry, but my eyes had blurred with tears and rage. I couldn't read anymore. I looked up to find Amber watching me, her own eyes wet with sympathy. "Logan, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Mom found this letter hidden in a box of old tax records in Dad's office. We both think, that he had something to do with my mother's death." I finished for her, the words burning like acid in my throat. That he rushed her treatment, prevented her from getting second opinions, maybe even... I couldn't complete the thought. It was too monstrous. "Mom's been talking to a lawyer," Amber said quietly, "about the insurance fraud implications at minimum. She's scared, Logan. Not just for herself, but for what this could mean for you." I nodded numbly, trying to process the magnitude of what these documents suggested. My entire understanding of my childhood, of my mother's death, of my father, all of it was built on shifting sand that was rapidly eroding beneath me. "There's one more thing," Amber said hesitantly. "Something Mom found just yesterday." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. Bank records from the past 5 years. She got them from Dad's home office computer. They show, well, he's been embezzling from his company. That's why he needed your college fund so badly. His scheme was about to be discovered, and he needed to cover shortfalls before the annual audit. I took the flash drive, turning it over in my palm as if it might bite. "Does he know your mom has all this?" Amber shook her head. "I don't think so. She's been careful. That's why she wanted me to show you today, while they're both gone." "What's she planning to do?" I asked, still struggling to fully comprehend everything I'd learned in the past 20 minutes. "Leave him, for starters. She's already opened a separate bank account and started moving her own money. The lawyer she's been talking to specializes in both financial fraud and..." She hesitated. "Suspicious deaths." The phrase hung in the air between us, giving terrible shape to what we were both thinking but couldn't quite bring ourselves to say aloud. Had my father murdered my mother for the insurance money? Had I spent 14 years loving, respecting, seeking approval from the man who had robbed me of my mother? "I need some air," I said abruptly, standing so quickly that the bar stool I'd been sitting on nearly toppled. I strode to the back door, stepping onto the patio that overlooked a meticulously landscaped backyard I'd never spent time in. Amber followed but kept a respectful distance, allowing me space to process. The September air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. Somewhere nearby, children were playing, their laughter floating over the fence, a jarring reminder that normal life continued all around us, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in this house. "What happens now?" I finally asked, turning back to face Amber. "If your mom goes to the authorities with this, Dad goes to prison," she finished plainly. "For the embezzlement, at minimum. For the other thing, I don't know. Mom's lawyer says it would be hard to prove after all this time. Prison." The word conjured images of my father in an orange jumpsuit behind bars. Despite everything, some small part of me, the 9-year-old boy who had worshipped him, recoiled at the thought. "Have you told anyone about this?" I asked, suddenly concerned about Tyler, about what I might have said to him in my anger over the college fund. "Just you," Amber assured me. "Mom's lawyer, of course, but no one else. Mom doesn't want anyone to know until we figure out what to do." I nodded, grateful for their discretion, even as I grappled with my own conflicting impulses. Part of me wanted justice, ruthless, immediate justice for my mother. Another part wanted to pretend I'd never seen these documents, to walk away and leave this twisted family drama behind me. "Does your mom have copies of all this?" I asked, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen where the damning evidence lay spread across the counter. Yes, and the originals of most of it. The letter from your mom to your aunt was in a safety deposit box Dad doesn't know about. Mom just has a copy. The insurance policy and medical records are copies from Dad's files. I nodded again, my military training kicking in, helping me organize my thoughts despite the emotional chaos. If your mom is planning to leave, she needs to be careful. Men who, I couldn't bring myself to say murder their wives. Men who do what we suspect he did don't just let people walk away with evidence against them. Fear flashed across Amber's face. You think he'd hurt Mom? I didn't know. The father I thought I knew would never harm anyone. But that man was a fiction, a carefully constructed mask worn by someone capable of unspeakable betrayal. Who knew what else he was capable of? Just tell her to be careful, I advised. Don't confront him alone. Don't let him know what she knows, until she's somewhere safe with all the evidence secured. Amber's phone buzzed, startling us both. She checked it, her face paling. It's Mom. Dad's meeting ended early. They're heading home now. They'll be here in 20 minutes. A surge of adrenaline coursed through me, the same feeling I'd had in Afghanistan when ambush was imminent. We need to get everything back exactly as it was. He can't know we've been here. We rushed inside, hastily gathering the documents, checking that everything was back in the folder. I pocketed the flash drive, and Amber returned the folder to a hidden compartment in her mother's closet. What will you do? She asked as we hurriedly straightened the kitchen, erasing all signs of our presence. I don't know yet, I answered honestly. I need time to think, to process all this. But I'll be in touch, soon. As we headed for the front door, a thought struck me. Amber, do you still have the contact information for my mother's attorney? The one mentioned in her letter? Goldman? I think Mom found it. I can text it to you. I nodded my thanks, and we stepped outside into the deceptively peaceful suburban afternoon. The contrast between the mundane setting and the horror of what we'd discovered was disorienting. Logan, Amber said as I turned to head to my car. I'm so sorry about all of it. The college fund, your mom, everything. There was genuine remorse in her eyes, a shared shock and grief that created an unexpected bond between us. We were both victims of my father's deception, both struggling to reconcile the man we thought we knew with the monster revealed in those documents. It's not your fault, I told her, meaning it. None of this is on you. We parted with a brief, awkward hug, our first physical contact beyond handshakes. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror to see her standing in the driveway, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the house that now seemed less like a home and more like a crime scene. Back in my apartment, I locked the door behind me, grateful that Tyler was out for the day. I needed solitude to navigate the hurricane of emotions raging within me. Grief freshly awakened for my mother, betrayal deeper than I'd ever imagined possible, rage that threatened to consume me entirely, and beneath it all, a terrible fear of what would happen next. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop, steeling myself for what I might find. Amber had been right. The financial records painted a clear picture of systematic embezzlement from Jensen & Partners, where my father had worked as CFO for the past decade. Small amounts at first, growing larger and more frequent over time. Exactly the pattern one would expect from someone growing bolder with each successful theft. But there was more. Buried within a folder innocuously labeled Tax Records 2008, I found something that made my blood run cold. A series of emails between my father and someone identified only as Dr. P, presumably the Dr. Peterson mentioned in my mother's letter. The emails were cryptic but damning, with references to accelerated treatment, increased dosages, and guaranteed results. One email, dated just a week before my mother's death, contained the chilling line, patient showing expected. Decline, outcome imminent, payment as discussed. I slammed my laptop shut, bile rising in my throat. I barely made it to the bathroom before emptying the contents of my stomach. Kneeling on the cold tile floor, shaking with a combination of physical reaction and emotional devastation, I finally allowed myself to face the full, horrific truth. My father had killed my mother. Had paid a doctor to administer treatment that would hasten her death rather than cure her illness. Had collected the insurance money and used it to fund a lifestyle that didn't include his only son. And when that money ran out, when his embezzlement scheme began to crumble, he'd stolen the college fund my mother had established to secure my future. My phone buzzed with a text from Amber. They're home. Mom playing it cool, but Dad seems suspicious. Be careful. Here's the attorney info you asked for. Followed by the contact information for Michael Goldman, the lawyer my mother had mentioned in her letter. I saved the information, then shut off my phone entirely. I needed to think without interruption to decide what to do with this terrible knowledge. Justice for my mother. The thought formed with crystal clarity amid the chaos. Whatever else happened, I would make sure she received justice. The man who had robbed her of her life, who had robbed me of my mother, would not escape accountability. But justice required evidence, required careful planning. Rush in with accusations based on 14-year-old documents, and my father would likely escape consequences. He was wealthy now, connected, respected in the community. I was a combat veteran with known PTSD, recently angry about financial issues. It wouldn't be hard for him to paint me as unstable, vengeful, imagining conspiracies. No, this would require strategy, would require allies. Diane, clearly. Goldman, if he was still practicing and remembered my mother's case. Perhaps even Amber, who had already demonstrated more courage and integrity than I would have expected from someone raised by James Erickson. As the shock began to recede, replaced by cold, focused determination, I opened my laptop again. I needed to preserve this evidence, to create backups in case anything happened to the originals. I needed to research statute limitations on murder, on insurance fraud, on embezzlement. I needed to prepare for the battle ahead. Not a battlefield of sand and bullets like Afghanistan, but a different kind of war altogether. One fought with evidence and testimonies, with financial records and medical experts. My father had taught me many things growing up, though perhaps not the lessons he'd intended. He'd taught me about masks, about how easily people can hide their true nature. He'd taught me about patience, as I waited year after year for the approval, and love that never fully materialized. Most of all, he'd taught me about justice, or rather, its absence, and what happened when the guilty went unpunished. It was time to apply those lessons. Time to become not just his son, but his reckoning, reprieve from the storm gathering on my horizon. The next 3 days passed in a blur of research and careful planning. I took a personal day from classes on Monday, something I'd never done before, and dedicated myself to understanding exactly what we were facing: legal websites, medical journals, forums for survivors of financial fraud. I immersed myself in all of it, building a foundation of knowledge for what lay ahead. By Tuesday morning, I had compiled enough information to know that we faced an uphill battle. The statute of limitations for most financial crimes in our state was 5 years, meaning the insurance fraud related to my mother's policy had expired long ago. However, murder had no statute of limitations. If we could prove my father had deliberately hastened my mother's death, justice was still possible. I resumed my classes and work shifts, moving through the motions of normal life while my mind remained focused on the investigation. Tyler noticed my distraction but assumed it was continued fallout from the college fund situation. I let him believe that, not yet ready to share the horrific truth I'd discovered. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a text from Amber. "Dad working late. Mom wants to meet with you. Goldman's office, 5 p.m. Can you make it? Goldman's office. Michael." Goldman, the attorney my mother had mentioned in her letter. Diane had obviously made contact with him, which meant things were moving faster than I'd anticipated. I texted back a quick confirmation and rearranged my schedule, telling Major Collins I needed to leave early for a family emergency. It wasn't far from the truth. The law offices of Goldman, Winters and Associates occupied the top floor of a modest office building downtown. When I arrived, precisely at 5, a receptionist escorted me immediately to a conference room where Diane and Amber were already seated alongside an older man I assumed was Goldman himself. "Logan," Diane rose to greet me, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than her typical styled look. "Thank you for coming. We had never been close, Diane and I. Our relationship had been cordial but distant, shaped by my frequent deployments and her arrival in my life long after I'd moved out of my father's house. Now, as she gripped my hand with unexpected intensity, I saw her not as my father's wife, but as another victim of his deception. "Mr. Erickson," Goldman extended his hand next, his grip firm despite his age, which I guessed to be around 70. "I've been waiting a very long time to meet you." That simple statement sent a chill through me. "You remember my mother's case?" He gestured for me to sit, his expression grave. "Your mother wasn't just a client, young man. She was a friend. I've thought about her and about you many times over the years." I took a seat across from him next to Amber, who offered a small, encouraging smile. "I've spent the past few days reviewing the materials Mrs. Erickson brought me," Goldman continued, nodding toward Diane, "including the letter your mother wrote to her sister. I've also pulled my own files from that time." He tapped a thick folder. On the table before him, "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear. I already know he killed her," I said bluntly, my voice steadier than I expected. "That he arranged for her treatment to be accelerated to collect the insurance. Money." Goldman's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "You've done your homework. Yes, that's what the evidence suggests. However, suspicion is not the same as proof that would stand up in court, particularly after so many years." "So there's nothing we can do?" Diane asked, the hope in her voice fading. "I didn't say that," Goldman corrected. "I said it would be difficult. Fortunately, your mother was a very intelligent woman, Logan. She suspected something was wrong with her treatment and took steps to document her concerns." He opened the folder and pushed several pages toward me, photocopies of what appeared to be a journal written in my mother's handwriting. She kept a record of her medications, her symptoms, the conversations with Dr. Peterson. She gave me copies for safekeeping, along with samples of her medications, which I still have, preserved in my personal safe. She told me that if anything happened to her, I should wait until you were older, then share everything with you. "Why wait?" I asked, struggling to control the anger rising within me. "Why not report your suspicions immediately after she died?" Goldman sighed heavily. "Because your mother made me promise to ensure your safety and well-being first. She was concerned that if James was capable of what she suspected, he might be dangerous to you as well if backed into a corner. She left instructions that I was to monitor your situation from a distance and only reveal what I knew when you were an adult, safely independent from your father. You've been watching me?" The idea was both comforting and unsettling. "Not in any invasive way," he assured me. "Annual checks to confirm your general welfare. I knew when you enlisted, when you deployed to Afghanistan, when you enrolled in university. I had planned to contact you after your graduation, but recent events have accelerated that timeline. I tried to process this revelation, that this stranger had been carrying out my mother's final wishes, watching over me from a distance while I remained completely unaware. It was overwhelming, yet strangely comforting to know she had tried to protect me even after death." "So, what happens now?" I asked, focusing on the practical. "Do we take this to the police?" Goldman and Diane exchanged a glance. "We need to be strategic," Diane said. "James has resources, connections. If we move too quickly without sufficient evidence, He could destroy records, disappear assets, even flee. Mrs. Erickson has already taken steps to secure her own financial position, Goldman added, and to document the embezzlement from Jensen and Partners. That will be our leverage point. Leverage? Amber spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. Are you saying we're not going to report him for what he did to Logan's mom? Goldman's expression remained carefully neutral. I'm saying we need to be realistic about what can be proven in court after 14 years. The embezzlement is recent, ongoing, and thoroughly documented. It gives us something concrete to take to authorities, opening the door for further investigation into historical concerns. I understood the strategy, even as part of me rebelled against it. Use the financial crimes to get him arrested, then push for investigation into my mother's death while he was already in custody, his credibility damaged. What about my college fund? I asked, the original betrayal that had started this entire revelation suddenly seeming almost trivial in comparison to murder. Already addressed, Diane said firmly. I've transferred the full amount plus interest into an account in your name. The paperwork is being processed. It was the least I could do, Logan. I'm so sorry I didn't realize sooner what kind of man I married. The simple act of restoration, of acknowledgement that a wrong had been committed against me, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I blinked, then back, maintaining the composure I'd learned in the military. Thank you, I managed. Both of you, for everything you're doing. Your mother would be proud of the man you've become, Goldman said quietly. She was so worried about how her absence would affect you. She'd be relieved to see your strength, your determination to seek justice rather than revenge. His words struck a chord I hadn't realized was so close to the surface. Justice versus revenge. Was I certain which one I was pursuing? The rage I felt toward my father went beyond a desire for legal consequences. There were moments when I fantasized about confronting him directly, making him feel a fraction of the fear my mother must have experienced when she realized what was happening to her. When do we move forward? I asked, pushing those darker thoughts aside. Friday, Goldman replied. Diane has a meeting scheduled with investigators from the Financial Crimes Division. They'll need your statement as well, Logan, regarding the college fund. It establishes a pattern of financial misconduct that extends beyond the company embezzlement. I nodded my agreement. I'll be there. Just tell me when and where. As the meeting concluded, Goldman pulled me aside while Diane and Amber gathered their things. There's something else, he said, his voice low. Something I didn't want to discuss. In front of them. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Your mother left this for you, to be delivered when I felt the time was right. I think that's now. I took the envelope with trembling hands, my mother's handwriting addressing it simply, for Logan, when he's ready. Thank you, I whispered, tucking it carefully into my jacket pocket. Whatever message she had left for me, I couldn't bear to read it in front of others, even those who were helping me seek justice for her. Goldman squeezed my shoulder gently. She loved you more than anything, son. Everything she did, including asking me to wait all these years, was to protect you. Remember that in the difficult days ahead. Outside the office building, Amber caught up with me as I headed toward my car. Logan, wait. I paused, turning to face her. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. How are you holding up? She asked, genuine concern in her eyes. This is all so much, so fast. I'm managing, I replied, the standard answer I'd given to military psychologists after difficult missions, true, but deliberately incomplete. She studied my face, unconvinced. If you need someone to talk to, I know we haven't been close, but I'm here. And I get it, you know. The feeling that your whole life has been built on lies, that the person who was supposed to love you most betrayed you in the worst possible way. Her words cut through my carefully maintained composure, touching the raw wound beneath. My father's betrayal of me paled in comparison to what he'd done to my mother, yet it still ached. The years spent seeking approval from a man who had murdered my mother, stolen my inheritance, and treated me as an inconvenient remnant of a past he wanted to forget. "Thanks," I managed, my voice rough. "It helps to know I'm not facing this alone." "You're not," she affirmed. "Mom and I, we're in this with you, whatever happens." As I drove home, the envelope from my mother seemed to burn through my jacket pocket, demanding attention. Yet I forced myself to wait until I was alone in my apartment, certain that Tyler would be out for at least another hour at his evening class. Sitting at my small kitchen table, I carefully broke the seal on the envelope, revealing several handwritten pages in my mother's familiar script. The date at the top, June 1st, 2009, hit me with physical force, just 3 days before her death. "My dearest Logan," it began. "If you're reading this, then my suspicions were correct, and I am no longer with you. I'm so sorry, my sweet boy. So sorry to leave you, especially under these circumstances. But I need you to understand what's happening and why I've made the choices I have." I paused, drawing a shaky breath before continuing. "I believe your father is poisoning me. The medication Dr. Peterson prescribed has been making me worse, not better. When I tried to request my records to seek a second opinion, your father intercepted the request. When I attempted to see another doctor without his knowledge, he lost my insurance card, making it impossible to receive care elsewhere. The life insurance policy he took out recently, far too large for our finances, was the final confirmation of what I had begun to suspect. Something is terribly wrong, Logan, and I fear I don't have much time left to protect you." Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading, my mother's final days unfolding before me in her own words, her growing certainty of what was happening, her careful documentation, her desperate attempts to create a safety net for me from beyond the grave. I've given copies of everything to Michael Goldman, a lawyer I trust completely. I've asked him to wait until you're grown, safely independent from your father, before sharing what we know. This may seem an impossible choice, to leave you with him, knowing what he's capable of, but it's the only way to ensure your immediate safety. If I confront him now, if authorities become involved while you're still a child, you would become a ward of the state or be placed with relatives who might not understand the trauma you've experienced. Worse, if your father evaded justice, a distinct possibility given his careful planning, you would be at his mercy, with me no longer present to protect you. So, I've made the hardest decision a mother can make. I've documented everything, created a record that cannot be denied, and entrusted it to those who will keep it safe until you're ready. I've also established a college fund in your name, with strict legal protections that should prevent your father from accessing it until you turn 25. I paused, a bitter laugh escaping me. Even that final protection had failed, thanks to legal loopholes my father had exploited. Most importantly, my darling boy, I need you to know that none of this is your fault. Your father's actions reflect his own brokenness, his own greed and moral failings. They have nothing to do with you, with your worthiness of love and protection. When the time comes for the truth to emerge, remember that justice matters more than revenge. Live your life with the integrity and compassion your father lacks. Don't let his darkness dim your light. I love you, Logan. I have loved you from your first breath, and I will love you beyond my last. Be brave, be kind, and know that wherever you go in life, a part of me goes with you. All my love forever, Mom. I sat motionless as night fell around me, the apartment growing dark except for the small kitchen light above me. My mother's final message, her love, her sacrifice, her foresight, washed over me in waves of grief and gratitude. She had known. In her final days, weak and ill from the very treatments meant to heal her, she had recognized what was happening and taken steps not just to document it, but to protect me even as she prepared to leave this world. the rage I'd been nursing toward, my father transformed into something colder, more focused. This wasn't just about what he'd done to me by taking my college fund. It wasn't even about the years of emotional distance and conditional love. This was about justice for the woman who had loved me enough to think beyond her own imminent death, to create a path that would eventually lead to this moment. Her son, grown and strong, finally able to face the truth she had so carefully preserved, Sao. I carefully folded her letter and returned it to its envelope. I made a silent promise, not just to seek justice, but to live as she had asked, with integrity, with purpose, with the compassion she had exemplified even in her darkest hour. My father would face consequences for what he had done, not through revenge, but through the very system of justice my military service had been meant to protect. This was no longer just a personal vendetta. It was a sacred obligation to the woman who had given me life twice over, once at birth, and again through her careful planning that had kept me safe until I could stand on my own. Friday morning arrived with a strange sense of calm settling over me. After days of emotional turmoil and frantic preparation, today was the day we would finally take action. The day my father would begin to face consequences for what he had done. First for the embezzlement and financial fraud, and eventually, if Goldman's strategy worked, for my mother's death. I dressed carefully in the only suit I owned, purchased for military formal events and rarely worn since. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The formal attire a stark contrast to my usual student attire of jeans and hoodies. But today wasn't about being a student. Today was about being my mother's son, her advocate after 14 years of silence. "Whoa, what's the occasion?" Tyler asked, emerging from his bedroom to find me adjusting my tie in our small living room mirror. "Job interview?" "Meeting with financial advisors," I lied smoothly. "About loan options for next semester." It wasn't that I didn't trust Tyler, but Goldman had emphasized the importance of keeping our plans contained to only those directly involved. The fewer people who knew, the less chance of my father being tipped off before the authorities were ready to move. "Good luck, man," Tyler said, grabbing his backpack. "Hope they hook you up with something better than those predatory emergency loans." I nodded my thanks, a twinge of guilt at the deception mixing with gratitude for his consistent support through what he thought was simply a family financial dispute. Someday I'd tell him the full truth, but not today. Not until it was over. My phone buzzed with a text from Amber. "Mom already at Goldman's office. Dad thinks she's at spa day. No suspicions yet." I responded with a quick acknowledgement and headed out, the morning air crisp against my face as I walked to my car. The drive to Goldman's office was a blur, my mind running through all we had prepared, all that might happen in the coming hours. Goldman's conference room had been transformed. Since our previous meeting, a detective from the Financial Crimes Division sat at one end of the table, her badge displayed prominently before her. A court reporter sat in the corner, ready to transcribe everything. Goldman himself looked more formal than before, his casual, sweater replaced with a sharp suit that belied his age. Diane sat rigidly in her chair, hands clasped tightly on the table before her. Amber was absent, a deliberate choice to keep her removed from the most damaging testimony against her stepfather. "Logan," Goldman greeted me, rising to shake my hand. "Thank you for being here. This is Detective Ramirez from the Financial Crimes Division. She'll be taking our formal statements today." Detective Ramirez nodded professionally. "Mr. Erickson, I understand this is a difficult situation. Please know that we take allegations of financial fraud very seriously, especially when they intersect with potential elder abuse or exploitation of military benefits." I took my seat beside Diane, the gravity of what we were about to do settling over me like a physical weight. Until this moment, our investigation had been private, painful, but contained. Once we gave these statements, there would be no turning back. My father's crimes would become a matter of public record, his reputation destroyed regardless of the legal outcome. "Before we begin," Goldman said, addressing both Diane and me. "I want to confirm one final time that you're prepared for. What happens next? Once Detective Ramirez has your statements and reviews the evidence we've compiled, she'll be seeking warrants. James will likely be arrested at his workplace, possibly as soon as this afternoon." Diane inhaled sharply, but nodded her confirmation. "I'm ready. He needs to be stopped before he can hurt anyone else." All eyes turned to me. This was my last chance to back out, to choose a different path, perhaps a private confrontation with my father, a family resolution rather than legal consequences. For a moment, I hesitated. The 9-year-old boy who had idolized his father, briefly overtaking the man who knew the terrible truth. Then I remembered my mother's words from her letter. Justice matters more than revenge. This was the path she had chosen, the one she had prepared for me to follow when the time was right. "I'm ready," I confirmed, my voice steady. The next 2 hours were grueling. Diane went first, methodically walking through the evidence of embezzlement she had discovered, her voice occasionally breaking as she described how she had uncovered not just financial fraud against his company, but the systematic draining of accounts that should have been shared marital assets. Then it was my turn. I described the college fund situation in detail, how I had discovered its depletion only when my tuition went unpaid, how my father had explicitly stated that Amber deserved it more because I had military benefits, how he had taken money, specifically designated by my mother for my education, and reassigned it without my knowledge or consent. As I spoke, Detective Ramirez took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight tightening of her jaw when I mentioned my service in Afghanistan, a tell I recognized from fellow veterans when confronted with what they perceived as disrespect toward those who had served. "And you believe this misappropriation of your college fund is connected to the larger pattern of embezzlement Mrs. Erickson has described?" she asked when I had finished. "Yes," I confirmed. "Based on the financial records we've reviewed, my father was using my college fund to cover personal shortfalls created by increasing scrutiny of the company accounts he had been embezzling from. He needed liquid assets quickly, and my fund was accessible to him as the custodian." Detective Ramirez nodded, making additional notes. "And the documentation you've provided includes bank records confirming the transfer?" "Yes, the full transfer. History is included in the materials Mr. Goldman has compiled." Goldman slid a thumb drive across the table. "Everything is here, Detective. Bank records, transfer confirmations, the original documentation establishing the college fund with Mrs. Erickson, Logan's mother, as the initiator. Also included are records of recent transfers Mrs. Erickson has made to restore the fund to its rightful owner, with appropriate interest." Detective Ramirez pocketed the drive, her expression now grimly satisfied. "This is more than sufficient for us to move forward with warrants. Based on what you've shared and the evidence provided, we'll be seeking authorization to access all of Mr. Erickson's financial records, as well as those of Jensen and Partners." She turned to face me directly. "Mr. Erickson, Logan, I understand from Mr. Goldman that there are additional concerns beyond the financial crimes we've discussed today. While those fall outside my direct jurisdiction, I want you to know that once my investigation begins, it often creates opportunities for other divisions to become involved. If there's evidence of additional wrongdoing, it won't be overlooked." It was as close as she could come to acknowledging what we all knew, that the financial crimes were merely our entry point into a much darker investigation. One that would eventually, we hoped, lead to justice for my mother. "Thank you," I said simply. As the meeting concluded, Detective Ramirez shook our hands with the solemn promise that she would be in touch very soon. The court reporter packed up her equipment, having created a formal record of our statements that could be used in future proceedings. "Did he say why he needed to find me?" I asked, abandoning my packing to peer cautiously through the blinds at the parking lot below. "Said it was a family emergency, that your sister was in the hospital. When I offered to take a message or help him contact you, He refused. Said he needed to speak to you in person immediately. Sister. I didn't have a sister, only a stepsister. The lie was transparent, clearly intended to manipulate Collins into revealing my whereabouts. Logan. Collins continued, his voice dropping, lower. Is there something going on I should know about? Are you in some kind of trouble? I hesitated, weighing how much to share. Collins was a veteran himself, someone who understood the complexities of family dynamics and the lingering effects of trauma, but involving him further might put him at risk. It's complicated, sir. Family situation. Nothing for you to worry about. There was a pause on the line. Erickson, in Afghanistan, you saved 3 men in your unit by recognizing a threat before anyone else did. I trust your instincts. If you say there's nothing to worry about, I'll believe you. But if you need backup, you've got it. No questions asked. The offer touched me deeply. This reminder that while my biological family had fractured beyond repair, I had another family in the brotherhood of veterans who had shared the crucible of combat. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that more than you. No. For now, I'm handling it. But I'll take appropriate precautions. See that you do, Collins replied gruffly. And Erickson? Keep your head on a swivel. Keep your head on a swivel. Standard advice in combat zones. A reminder to maintain constant awareness of your surroundings. The fact that Collins felt it, necessary to offer this caution in civilian life, spoke volumes about how serious he considered the situation. After we disconnected, I finished packing with renewed urgency, my military training kicking in fully now. If my father was already actively searching for me, the situation had escalated beyond what any of us had anticipated. Detective Ramirez might not have secured her warrants yet, meaning my father was still free to move about, and potentially dangerous if he suspected what was coming. I texted Goldman, "Father looking for me at Veterans Office. Lied about emergency to try to get my location. How soon until arrest?" His response came quickly. "Detective still with judge. Warrant expected within hour. Stay away from apartment and campus until confirmation of arrest." Next, I texted Amber, "Is your mom at hotel yet? Father looking for me." "Yes. Checked in 20 minutes ago," she replied immediately. "What do you mean he's looking for you? How would he know something's wrong?" That was the question haunting me as well. How had he known? Had one of us been careless, left evidence of our investigation where he could find it? Or was this standard paranoia from a man who had spent years covering up multiple crimes? I shoved the last of my essentials into the duffel bag and did a quick sweep of the apartment, making sure I wasn't leaving behind anything that might reveal our plans if my father somehow gained access. My mother's letter I kept with me, tucked, securely in an inside pocket of my jacket. If nothing else survived this ordeal, her final words to me would. As I prepared to leave, a text from Detective Ramirez via Goldman arrived. "Warrant secured. Officers en route to Jensen and Partners and Erickson residence. Do not return to either location until confirmation of suspect in custody." It was happening. After 14 years of living with a murderer, justice was finally in motion. I should have felt triumph, relief, some sense of closure. Instead, an inexplicable dread settled over me. A combat veteran's intuition that the most dangerous moment in any operation is often just before its completion, when the target realizes they've been compromised. My father now knew something was wrong. He was actively searching for me, which meant he suspected I was involved in whatever had alerted his finely tuned sense of self-preservation. He was cornered, his crimes about to be exposed. And if there was one thing I had learned about my father, it was that he would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect himself, regardless of who got hurt in the process. With that chilling thought foremost in my mind, I shouldered my duffel bag and headed for the door, already formulating a plan to stay mobile and untraceable until I received confirmation that the man who had murdered my mother, stolen my inheritance, and betrayed my trust in every conceivable way was finally, irrevocably, behind bars. I left my apartment building through the rear exit, scanning the parking lot carefully before approaching my car. No sign of my father's silver Lexus, no unfamiliar vehicles idling nearby. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention, a sensation I'd learned to trust in Afghanistan. The body's warning system activating before the conscious mind fully processes a threat. Instead of heading directly to my car, I circled the building once, maintaining situational awareness as I'd been trained. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. Perhaps it was just hypervigilance, my brain's natural response to the day's stress and revelations, or perhaps something more concrete. I paused at the corner of the building, using the reflection in a ground floor window to check behind me. A blue sedan that had been parked near the entrance when I first looked was now gone. Coincidence? Or someone repositioning? Rather than risk it, I made a split-second decision to abandon my car altogether. It was registered in my name, easily traceable. If my father was truly hunting for me, it would be the first place he'd look. Adjusted my duffel bag on my shoulder and headed toward the campus bus stop 2 blocks away. Public transportation would be slower, but far less trackable. As I walked, I sent another text to Goldman. Noticed possible surveillance near apartment. Taking alternate transportation. Will contact when secure. His response was immediate. Good. Instincts. Officers at Jensen and Partners now. James not at office. Left suddenly 30 minutes ago claiming family emergency. Current whereabouts unknown. The message sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. My father had fled his office before the police arrived. He knew. Somehow, he knew what was coming. And now he was in the wind, potentially dangerous, definitely looking for me. I quickened my pace, keeping to busier streets where the presence of witnesses might deter any confrontation. The campus bus arrived within minutes, and I boarded, taking a seat at the back where I could observe all other passengers. No one suspicious boarded after me. Small mercies. As the bus rumbled toward downtown, I considered my options. Hotels required ID, creating an electronic trail. Friends' homes might endanger them if my father was truly desperate. What I needed was somewhere completely disconnected from my known life, somewhere he wouldn't think to look. The answer came as the bus passed a familiar landmark, St. Michael's Church, where weekly veterans support meetings were held in the basement. I'd attended a few times after returning from Afghanistan, finding the combination of structure and anonymity helpful during my adjustment to civilian life. The church maintained a small overnight shelter for veterans in transition, just 6 beds in rooms adjacent to the meeting space. I'd never stayed there myself, but I knew the intake process was minimal, designed to remove barriers for veterans who might be struggling with documentation or bureaucracy. No electronic registration, no credit card required. Just a DD-214 and a need for temporary sanctuary. I pulled the stop request cord and exited at the next corner, walking the 3 blocks to St. Michael's with purposeful strides. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, the autumn day surrendering to an early dusk that matched my mood. Father Timothy, the church's longtime pastor and a Vietnam veteran himself, was arranging hymn books in the sanctuary when I entered. He looked up, recognition and mild surprise crossing his weathered face. "Logan Erickson, right? Haven't seen you at a meeting in some time." "Yes, sir," I confirmed, automatically falling into the respectful address I'd use with a senior officer. I was hoping I might use the veterans' shelter tonight, running into some housing issues. Father Timothy studied me, taking in the duffel bag, my formal attire now slightly rumpled from the day's tensions, the alertness in my stance that betrayed my current state of vigilance. Whatever he saw seemed to confirm that I was indeed a veteran in need. "Of course," he said simply, not pressing for details I clearly wasn't offering. "The evening meeting starts at 7. Shelter intake happens right after. You're welcome to wait in the common room until then." I thanked him and headed downstairs to the church basement, where the veterans' spaces were located. The common room was empty this early. The coffee station shut down until meeting time. I chose a seat in the corner, back to the wall, clear, sightline to both the stairwell entrance and the emergency exit. Old habits. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Ramirez, apparently now in direct contact. APB issued for James Erickson. Officers at residence found evidence of hasty packing, vehicle being tracked. "Where are you?" I provided my location, assuring her I was safe and surrounded by other veterans who would notice any disturbance. She seemed satisfied with this arrangement, but instructed me to maintain regular contact and to notify her immediately if I spotted my father or received any communication from him. As I waited for the evening meeting to begin, I checked in with Amber, who confirmed that she and Diane remained secure at the Madison Hotel with upgraded security watching their room. The hotel staff had been instructed not to confirm their presence to anyone inquiring, and room service would deliver meals directly to minimize their movement through public areas. "Mom's a wreck," Amber texted, blaming herself for not seeing the signs sooner. Says if she'd been more attentive, maybe she could have stopped him before he took your college fund. I assured her that no one could have anticipated my father's actions, that he'd spent years perfecting his deception, crafting a public persona that effectively masked the monster beneath. Even I, his own son, had been fooled for most of my life. The truth was, I didn't blame Diane. If anything, I was grateful for her swift action once she discovered the truth. Her immediate move to restore my college fund. Her willingness to risk her own security by providing evidence against her husband. Her commitment to seeing justice done not just for me, but for my mother. By 7 o'clock, veterans began arriving for the support meeting. Many nodded in greeting, recognizing me from previous attendance, but none pressed for conversation. That was one of the things I had always appreciated about these gatherings, the implicit understanding that everyone carried burdens they might not wish to discuss, and the respect for each person's boundaries. I participated minimally in the meeting, sharing only my name and years of service when my turn came in the circle. The focus that evening was on transitioning skills from military to civilian life, identifying how combat training and experiences could be reframed as valuable perspectives in everyday situations. Under normal circumstances, I might have contributed more actively. Tonight, I was content to listen, to absorb the familiar cadence of military speech patterns, the shorthand of shared experience. After the meeting, I completed the simple intake process for the shelter, showing my military ID, signing a basic agreement to follow community rules, receiving a locker key and toiletry kit. The volunteer handling intake, a retired Marine named Chuck, assigned me to bed 3 in the small dormitory-style room. "Quiet hours start at 10, he informed me. "Breakfast at 7. If you need to leave earlier, coffee makers available in the common room. Any questions?" I shook my head, thanking him for the accommodation. The setup was basic, but clean. 6 twin beds with privacy partitions, shared bathroom facilities, secure lockers for personal belongings. After the emotional intensity of the day, its simplicity was comforting. No decisions to make, no complexities to navigate. Just the essential needs met with military efficiency. I texted my location details to Detective Ramirez, then settled onto my assigned bed, back against the wall, checking my phone periodically for updates. 3 of the other beds were occupied by veterans in various states of repose, one reading, another seemingly asleep despite the early hour, the third working, on what appeared to be job applications on a battered laptop. None of them paid me any particular attention, another mercy of this environment. Whatever had brought each of us to this shelter, PTSD, financial hardship, family breakdown, substance issues, it remained our own business unless we chose to share it. As 10 o'clock approached and lights out was announced, I received a final, Update from Detective Ramirez. James Erickson's vehicle located abandoned at North Shore Marina. Coast Guard and Harbor Patrol notified. No confirmation of subject boarding any vessel. Investigation continuing through night. The Marina. An unexpected development. My father wasn't particularly nautical. He owned no boat that I was aware of, had never expressed interest in sailing or water activities. Why would he abandon his car there? Was it a genuine escape attempt via water, or a misdirection designed to buy time while he fled by other means? I shared this thought with Ramirez, who responded that they were considering all possibilities. The abandoned vehicle was being processed for evidence, and security camera footage from the marina was under review. She assured me that the investigation was receiving priority attention, with officers working through the night. As the shelter lights dimmed for quiet hours, I lay awake, turning over the day's revelations in my mind. My father was now officially a fugitive, running from financial crimes that were just the surface of his true depravity. Somewhere out there, the man who had killed my mother, stolen my inheritance, and betrayed every principle of parenthood, was desperately seeking escape from consequences. Sleep seemed impossible under such circumstances, yet my military training had taught me to rest whenever opportunity allowed, knowing that clarity of mind might be needed at any moment. I forced myself through familiar relaxation techniques: controlled breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, mental compartmentalization of concerns that could not be immediately addressed. Eventually, physical exhaustion overcame emotional turmoil, and I drifted into a light sleep, still partially alert to my surroundings as I'd learned to be in combat zones. Dreams came in fragmented bursts. My mother's face as I remembered it from childhood. My father standing over her hospital bed with an unreadable expression. Afghanistan's dusty landscapes bleeding into the marina where my father's car had been, abandoned. I woke with a start at 5:43 a.m. according to my phone, heart pounding from a dream I couldn't fully recall, but that left me with a sense of urgent foreboding. Something about water, about drowning, about hands pushing down instead of pulling up. The shelter was quiet, the other veterans still sleeping in the dim light filtering through small basement windows. I checked my phone. No updates from Ramirez or Goldman during the night. Whatever my father's plan had been in abandoning his car at the marina, it had apparently bought him at least one night's freedom from apprehension. I slipped from my bed as quietly as possible, gathering my duffel bag and heading to the common room where the promised coffee maker waited. As I waited for the ancient machine to finish its brewing cycle, Father Timothy appeared, apparently an early riser himself. "Sleep well?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "Well enough," I replied with the automatic stoicism of a soldier reporting to a superior. He nodded, accepting the polite fiction. Sometimes the first night in a strange place is the hardest. It gets easier. "I appreciate the shelter," I said sincerely. It was exactly what I needed. "And today? What do you need today, Logan?" The question caught me off guard with its directness, its implicit acknowledgement that my needs extended beyond a night's safe accommodation. What did I need? Justice for my mother, safety for Diane and Amber, my father in custody, unable to harm anyone else, closure for 14 years of unknowing complicity in his deception, clarity, I finally answered, direction. Father Timothy nodded thoughtfully. The most honest answer I've heard in some time. He poured himself a cup of the now ready coffee, adding nothing to the black liquid. When I returned from Vietnam, I was lost. Not physically, I knew where I was. But spiritually, morally, I couldn't find my bearings. The man I'd been before deployment no longer existed, and I hadn't yet discovered who I was becoming. I recognized the sentiment all too well. That disorienting period after returning from Afghanistan, when civilian life had seemed simultaneously too loud and too quiet, too complicated and too meaningless. What changed? I asked, genuinely curious about his journey. I stopped running from what had happened and started walking toward what could be. he said simply. I acknowledged the past without letting it dictate my future. Harder than it sounds, he added with a wry smile. Took me about 10 years and a lot of wrong turns. As we talked, my phone vibrated with an incoming call. Goldman. I excused myself to answer, stepping toward the empty meeting room for privacy. Logan? Goldman's voice was tense, urgent. Where are you right now? St. Michael's Church Veterans Shelter, I reminded him. What's happened? You need to relocate immediately. Your father's vehicle was found at North Shore Marina, less than 2 miles from your location. We believe he may have planted it there deliberately, knowing it would be found quickly. My pulse quickened. You think he knows where I am? We can't. Rule it out. The investigation has revealed he's been tracking your movements more closely than any of us realized. They found detailed notes at the house, your class schedule, work hours, regular haunts, even receipts from restaurants you frequent, suggesting he's been following you for weeks. The revelation sent a chill through me. While I'd been discovering my father's crimes, he had apparently been conducting his own surveillance. The question was why? What had prompted this monitoring before he had any reason to suspect I was investigating? Him? Detective Ramirez is sending an officer to escort you to a secure location? Goldman continued. They should arrive within 15 minutes. Stay inside the church until they get there. I agreed and ended the call, my mind racing. If my father had been tracking me for weeks, he might indeed know about my occasional attendance at St. Michael's. The church wasn't far from the marina where he'd abandoned his car. What if that wasn't misdirection, but positioning, placing himself within striking distance of where he suspected I might seek refuge? I returned to the common room, where Father Timothy was still enjoying his coffee, apparently in no hurry to begin his day's duties. Everything all right? He asked, noting my changed demeanor. I need to leave, I said, choosing honesty without full disclosure. There's a situation. Police are sending an escort. He nodded, unsurprised. Thought it might be something like that. You've had the look since you arrived. Not just a veteran needing shelter, but a man being hunted. Before I could respond, a text from Amber appeared. Dad just called Mom's phone. Said he knows where you are. Said everything that's happening is because of you. He sounded desperate, Logan. Be careful. I showed the message to Father Timothy, abandoning any pretense. My father's dangerous. The police are looking for him, but he may come here. You should lock down the shelter, get the other veterans to a secure area. To his credit, Father Timothy didn't waste time with questions. He immediately moved toward the emergency protocols posted near the door, activating the church's security system with a code, and picking up a phone to alert staff who might be arriving for morning duties. I positioned myself near the stairwell, the only entrance to the basement area from inside the church. If my father attempted to reach me here, he would have to come through that door. The emergency exit at the far end of the hall led directly outside, providing an escape route if needed. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The other veterans, now awake and aware that something was happening, followed Father Timothy's instructions to move to the shelter's back room, away from potential danger. I remained by the stairs, my military training taking over, establishing a defensive position, controlling access to the most vulnerable areas, maintaining communication with those who could provide assistance. At 6:27 a.m., the outside door to the church opened. I heard footsteps in the sanctuary above, too heavy to be Father Timothy returning from securing the building, too purposeful to be someone unaware of what they sought. My father had found me. I pressed myself against the wall, beside the stairwell, controlling my breathing as the footsteps above grew closer. Years of combat training took over, assessing threats, planning contingencies, maintaining tactical advantage. The steps paused at the top of the stairs, and I knew with absolute certainty it was my father. Logan. His voice floated down, eerily, calm despite the circumstances. I know you're down there. We need to talk. I remained silent, weighing my options. The police escort Goldman had promised was still minutes away at best. Father Timothy had secured the other veterans, but my father's unpredictability made him dangerous to everyone in the building. "It's not what you think," he continued, taking the first step down. "Whatever they've told you, Diane, that lawyer, they don't understand the full picture." Another step, then another, his voice growing closer. "Your mother was already dying, Logan. The treatments weren't working. What I did was mercy." Rage surged through me at his audacity to frame murder as mercy, to justify his greed as compassion. But I maintained discipline, not revealing my position. The insurance money was meant to secure our future, yours and mine. Things just got complicated. He reached the bottom of the stairs, his eyes adjusting to the dim basement lighting. I could see him clearly now, disheveled in a way I'd never witnessed before, his normally immaculate appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and unshaven face. He looked older, smaller somehow, stripped of the powerful presence I'd grown up fearing and respecting. "The college fund," he continued, scanning the room, still not spotting me in the shadow beside the stairwell. "That was just temporary. I was going to replace it once this business situation resolved. Amber just needed it more urgently." Each word revealed more of his twisted reasoning, his inability to acknowledge the true nature of his crimes. In his mind, he remained the hero of his own story, all actions justified by his intentions, regardless of who suffered. "There you are," he said suddenly, eyes locking onto mine as I shifted position. "Logan, son, you need to understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, stepping into the light. "I understand that you murdered my mother for insurance money, that you stole my inheritance, that you've been lying to me my entire life." His face hardened, the mask of concerned father slipping to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "You have no proof of anything, just speculation and old documents that can be explained a dozen different ways." "The police have everything," I replied steadily. "Your embezzlement, the transfers from my college fund, Mom's medical records, her letter to Aunt Kate, the emails between you and Dr. Peterson." With each item I listed, I saw his confidence falter, replaced by the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. His hand moved slightly toward his jacket pocket. "Show me your hands," I commanded, the authority in my voice surprising us both. He hesitated, then slowly raised his hands to shoulder height, empty, but the motion confirmed my suspicion that he was armed. "What were you planning to do, Dad? Shoot me? Add another murder to cover the first?" "Don't be dramatic," he scoffed, but his eyes betrayed him, cold, assessing, considering options that no father should ever contemplate regarding his child. "The police are on their way," I informed him. "Detective Ramirez has warrants for your arrest, financial crimes for now, but they'll keep digging. They'll find everything about Mom." "They'll find nothing," he snapped, his composure cracking. "I was careful, so careful. 14 years and no one suspected a thing until you started poking around where you don't belong." His admission hung in the air between us. Not just a confession of guilt, but a revelation of pride in his deception, in maintaining the elaborate facade that had fooled everyone for so long. "Why were you tracking me?" I asked, the question that had been nagging since Goldman's call. "The receipts from restaurants I visit, my schedule. Why watch me before you had any reason to think I was investigating you?" A strange expression crossed his face, something like embarrassment mixed with defiance. "You're my investment, Logan, my creation. You think military service and engineering school were your ideas? I've been guiding your development since you were 9 years old. Everything you are, everything you've achieved, it's because of my influence, my planning." The statement was so delusional, so narcissistic that I almost laughed. "I enlisted because I wanted as far away from you as possible. I chose engineering because Mom always said I had a gift for understanding how things work. Your mother," he spat, true contempt finally emerging, had no vision for your future. She would have let you become a musician for God's sake, wasting your potential on some artistic nonsense. I made you practical, disciplined. She would have let me become myself, I corrected, understanding flowing through me. That's what you couldn't stand, that she loved me unconditionally, while you only valued what you could shape me into. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. My father's head jerked toward the sound, panic replacing the smug superiority of moments before. "They're coming for you," I said quietly. "It's over, Dad." His hand moved with unexpected speed toward his pocket. I reacted instinctively, launching forward in a tackle honed through military training. We crashed to the floor, his reach for the weapon interrupted by my momentum. The gun, a small revolver I'd never seen before, skittered across the concrete floor. We struggled briefly, but years of combat conditioning gave me an insurmountable advantage over a man whose battles had always been fought with manipulation rather than strength. I pinned him face down, using my weight to immobilize him until help arrived. "You're just like her," he gasped, still struggling, weak, sentimental, thinking love matters more than success. "Mom wasn't weak," I replied, maintaining my hold. "She faced death knowing what you'd done, and still found the strength to protect me. She left evidence, arranged for Goldman to watch over me, made sure that someday the truth would come out. That wasn't weakness. That was courage you'll never understand." The church doors burst open above us, and multiple sets of footsteps thundered toward the stairwell. Detective Ramirez appeared first, weapon drawn, followed by uniformed officers, who quickly took control of the situation. Father Timothy watched from the emergency exit doorway, where he'd been guarding the other veterans, his expression a mixture of sadness and relief. As the officers led my father away in handcuffs, he looked back once, his eyes meeting mine with a hatred that confirmed every suspicion, every fear I'd harbored. This man had never truly loved me, had never been capable of love at all. I was simply an extension of himself, a project to be managed, an investment to be monitored. "You'll regret this," he called as they guided him up the stairs. "When everything comes out, you'll wish you'd listened to me." But I felt only a profound relief watching him go. The monster of my childhood finally revealed for what he truly was, no longer hidden behind the mask of fatherhood he'd worn so convincingly. In the Dawai, weeks that followed, justice moved with surprising speed. The financial crimes were straightforward enough that my father's defense attorney quickly sought a plea deal. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he confessed to embezzlement and misappropriation of my college fund in exchange for what he thought would be a reduced sentence. What he didn't anticipate was that his plea opened the door for the more serious investigation to proceed with full force. The insurance fraud, the suspicious circumstances of my mother's death, the documented collusion with Dr. Peterson, all of it now subject to renewed scrutiny without the financial crimes to distract from the underlying murder. Dr. Peterson, now retired and living in Arizona, agreed to testify against my father in exchange for immunity, confirming what the emails had suggested, a deliberate plan to administer treatments that would hasten my mother's decline rather than slow it, all timed perfectly to coincide with the insurance policy's activation. Today, my father sits in a maximum security prison, serving consecutive sentences that ensure he will never again walk free. My mother's college fund has been fully restored, allowing me to complete my engineering degree without the burden of loans. More importantly, her name has been cleared. Her death recognized not as a tragic medical failure, but as the crime it truly was. Diane and Amber have become, unexpectedly, part of my chosen family. Not replacements for what I lost, but new connections, forged through shared trauma and recovery. We gather monthly for dinner, sometimes with Goldman joining us, all of us bound by the truth we fought to uncover. And perhaps most surprisingly, I've found peace. Not the peace of forgetting. I'll never forget what my father did or how my mother died. but the peace of knowing that justice, however delayed, was finally served. That the secrets that poisoned my life for 14 years have been exposed. To the light, allowing healing to begin. If you're watching this and it resonates with your own experience, if you've ever discovered that someone you trusted has betrayed you in ways you never imagined possible, know that you're not alone. Family secrets can destroy us if we let them, but they can also set us free when we find the courage to face them. In the weeks that followed, justice moved with surprising speed. The financial crimes were straightforward enough that my father's defense attorney quickly sought a plea deal. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he confessed to embezzlement and misappropriation of my college fund in exchange for what he thought would be a reduced sentence. What he didn't anticipate was that his plea opened the door for the more serious investigation to proceed with full force. The insurance fraud, the suspicious circumstances of my mother's death, the documented collusion with Dr. Peterson, all of it now subject to renewed scrutiny without the financial crimes to distract from the underlying murder. Dr. Peterson, now retired and living in Arizona, agreed to testify against my father in exchange for immunity, confirming what the emails had suggested. A deliberate plan to administer treatments that would hasten my mother's decline rather than slow it, all timed perfectly to coincide with the insurance policy's activation. Today, my father sits in a maximum security prison, serving consecutive sentences that ensure he will never again walk free. My mother's college fund has been fully restored, allowing me to complete my engineering degree without the burden of loans. More importantly, her name has been cleared. Her death recognized not as a tragic medical failure, but as the crime it truly was. Diane and Amber have become, unexpectedly, part of my chosen family. Not replacements for what I lost, but new connections, forged through shared trauma and recovery. We gather monthly for dinner, sometimes with Goldman joining us, all of us bound by the truth we fought to uncover, and perhaps most surprisingly, I've found peace. Not the peace of forgetting. I'll never forget what my father did or how my mother died, but the peace of knowing that justice, however delayed, was finally served. That the secrets that poisoned my life for 14 years have been exposed. To the light, allowing healing to begin. If you're watching this and it resonates with your own experience, if you've ever discovered that someone you trusted has betrayed you in ways you never imagined possible, know that you're not alone. Family secrets can destroy us if we let them, but they can also set us free when we find the courage to face them. My story isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. A life no longer defined by deception but built on truth, however painful that truth might be. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of survival, justice, and redemption. Next week, I'll share how I discovered that my mother's journal contained clues not just to her murder, but to my father's earlier crimes that no one suspected, until now. Because sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property, it's the truth that sets us free.